just introduce you to Elaine Bing. She's the author of Unmaking of Torture, and I just have to apologize. Our posters said Unmaking of Torture, but we've explained that there was a last minute swap. Yeah, it just happens. Anyway, Elaine Bing's author of Unmaking of the Torture, and Elaine, just introduce you to the people here. I think we've got members of the Social Justice Coalition, who are an organization based in Khayelitsha. Some of them are fellows here who come and do some of our courses here at NU. There's also members of Nkululeko Line, another organization working in Kuyasa. There's quite a lot of people from Equal Education here as well. And there's a few members of the public as well. I'm not sure. Do you want to just introduce yourselves?
Tyrone. I know some of you guys. Just a student.
Great. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Amelia. I'm also just a student.
Great.
I'm going from community law.
Community law is at UWC, right? Okay. And then, of course, the rest are from NU staff, and that's Elaine's husband over there. That's Jerry. So Elaine's down to present at WordFest tomorrow. When we heard about Elaine's book, I think Elaine contacted Zaki, and Zaki was very interested because it kind of mixes quite nicely with NU's work and the kind of interests actually that he is involved in as well. If we're thinking about our work around policing and around trying to secure safety in the communities that we work in, Elaine's work kind of gives us a little bit of insight into, actually, let's just dig down to the people. We often say that there's a culture of brutality amongst police. And I know in a lot of the testimony and evidence given at the Commission of Inquiry, this is mentioned a lot, a culture of brutality. And Elaine's work is around three men who were policemen during apartheid years and who were torturers. And Elaine's a psychologist and gives us a unique insight into these men, how they came to be torturers, and perspective on that. So I hand over to Elaine to introduce us a bit more to the work, and then we'll have a few questions.
Good. I'd actually like lots of questions. So thank you for this, and I actually think I have Tyrone to blame for it. For making the contact. Okay. Jared suggested that I maybe read something from it, and I was sort of debating, should I do it at the beginning or should I do it at the end? But I think we're going to do it in the beginning, because it gives a bit of an idea of what the content is. What I'll do after that is give some indication of how I got into this, what it's developed from. Alright, so let me read this. The man speaking, I called Tiens. Tiens, the first time he came in, I'll give you that background, he came in, he sat down, I said to him after he filled in the various forms you fill in when you see a shrink, and I said to him, why have you come in? He spoke Afrikaans, but I'll give a rough translation in English, and he said, I want to be medically boarded from the police. I have the following records for torture. And he told me what they were. Internally, I thought, and you're a fucking psychopath, get out of my office. He didn't wise up to my internal dialogue, and he continued to make appointments. He did not underestimate his activity. I think he was involved in extensive torture. Good. So let me read one of the sessions that I had with him. He said the following, and this goes a bit about starting torture, how it developed, how they set up situations so that they would not be caught. Tiens, I always had arrests. Then the assault cases started. You learned to tube, to give electric shocks. He would not give information if you spoke to him. You had to use other methods to get it out of him. How did it start, Tiens? It happened over time. It began with assaults in the back of the bakkie. The old hands showed you, like why? And like Matumi, a black who worked with me, and who said to me, put me in the back with him. When I knock, you'll know I have finished. As I said, there were assaults. The man was never assaulted, as I never saw anything. I knew what was happening, but we covered each other's backs. We were 7 guys who put in statements. He was on his own. 7 statements against 1. So we learnt. You can do it. The identity parades. You'd walk in one side and out the other. Someone who looked a bit like you would stand in your place, like H and me. If he was in shit, I stood in for him. He laughs. And when I was in shit, he stood in for me. If other guys who looked completely different didn't look like you, shorter, smaller, things like that, they would have to point out that man. You always had an alibi. You were always somewhere else. We knew. He and I never worked in the same areas. We never worked the same hours. We weren't in the same company. Things like that. It worked. It was a winning formula. The officers covered up for us. He would certify that you'd been at the parade. You were at the parade. There were boards which could be moved hither and thither. There was a stretcher behind the boards. You'd lie on the stretcher behind the boards while the identity parade was being held. After the parade, you'd walk out with the others. The investigating officer would see you coming out. The investigating officers were not allowed at the parade, as he was investigating the case against you. He was not allowed there. He was not allowed to see what was happening there. One of our officers held the identity parade. You were given a very clear message. Yes, untouchable. You can do as you please, and it's always someone else's fault. It's never our fault. Okay, quite a chilling message from Tians. How I got into this. For a period in South Africa, it's calmed down a little bit now, but for a number of years, as a psychologist in private practice, you had weekly referrals of people who were in the police who were not coping. Generally, they would come in with the ready-made diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, most of the time referred by some psychiatrist. What they were actually saying was, I don't want to continue working, I'm not happy with how the police have changed, the organization has changed following 95. I began to become aware of many of them would say things like, somewhere in the first interview normally, sometimes the second, something like, I've done things I'm not proud of. But it'd be a sort of throwaway remark. And I would eventually start to pick up a little bit on this. And then had some curiosity. I began to realize a lot of these people had been involved in quite serious perpetration. Perpetration I essentially defined eventually as when you do something which will harm another human being. Okay? Even in the case of justified killings, because some of them were involved in justified killings, but they would still be seen as perpetrators. They have done something. So I found out that many of these people had been involved in some form of perpetration. My curiosity, I suppose, was not good for me, but anyway, I got involved in it and started to find out more, and eventually did a doctorate on the subject. And I thought it might be useful to give a little bit of information, what I got from the doctorate, that eventually became a book. So the book is sort of, in a way, a far less academic version of what I got from the doctorate, which incidentally, those that are interested, it is open access at UNISA. So if you wanted, you can simply download it, the references in the book. Okay, so I was not interested, particularly, there's quite a lot of work being done on why people do things like torture, why people do kill. That is, there's, with all the genocide and stuff we've had, that's reasonably well researched. But in terms of what it does to the person who does kill, who does torture, what it does to them, how they come to terms with it, especially when a dispensation changes, that was where my interest lay. So you've now been in South Africa, you've behaved atrociously in the police, but you could justify it. You could say, I'm doing this for idealistic reasons, and it was done for ideological reasons. None of them that I've worked with went into the police saying, and these people all in the police, I didn't work with people in the army, none of them went into the police saying, I want to go and torture. They went in saying, I want to protect my country. And during apartheid, white interests was the main part that they were interested in. So it develops from ideological reasons, which is what we find with many of the genocides and things that have happened throughout the world as well. Ideology is the problem. And people wanting to do good is the problem. Right. So the question was, now you've done all this, how do you live with yourself afterwards? Things have changed. How do you make peace with yourself? Your ideology is no longer working. So those are the questions I went into it with. I very deliberately took in a standpoint which was away from the human rights movement. I didn't want to take in that position, because if I take in that position, I closed down the conversation. And I actually wanted to hear what they had to say. So I went in as openly as I possibly could without prior judgment. Okay. Which is not good for any researcher, I might add. It's very bad for you as a psychologist. I got a number of themes from the research. It's a very extensive thesis. It's 1,000 pages long, so I'm not going to go into all of that now. But I'll give you some of the themes I got, because they were quite interesting. One of the first things, which I suspect is very, very similar now, as it was then, is the initiation and the hazing when you join the police as an organization. So they were taught systematically to do a few things. One of them is dehumanize other people. And this is not just here. Police worldwide are taught on some level, the person out there is a problem, he's not one of us. And they were almost, if as soon as there is a suspect or a criminal, suspected criminal, they will dehumanize almost automatically. It is part of the culture. Anyone who speaks to, I think it's used mainly in Afrikaans, policemen, will have them refer to have heard them refer to Haasmanner, and that's a civilian. Okay, but it's a derogatory term. Right, so they were trained in obedience to authority and taught police culture through hazing. Also taught to do illogical things without question, which is part of why you do hazing. Don't have people think about what they do, just do it. Follow orders without thinking. One of the stories I give them is quite an interesting one. It happened at Ndifuna. Ndifuna has been closed down, fortunately, but at that point it was used for counter-insurgency training. And the people who were doing most of the training were the crowd from Krufut. So you can imagine, the training was not good for human beings. And one of the stories one of the men told me, and became extremely upset when he told me the story, was how, for some made-up infringements of the rules, they were forced to swim through the sewage dams repeatedly. They had to run, and then they had to swim through the sewage dams that were on Ndifuna. And then after that they had to go and roll on their beds and dirty all their clothes backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. And I asked him when he told me the whole story, so what did you make of this? What did you get out of this? Why did they teach you this? Why did they do this to you? And he said, so that we would not waste food, because that was the made-up excuse. He never connected it to the fact that they were actually trying to dehumanize them, to humiliate them, to embarrass them. That he didn't think about. But the message got through very strongly, this is what we do to other people. Okay. They found with the Greek torturers, where there was systematic training in torture, that was one of the things that they did, is teach people to torture and be tortured yourself. Some of the South American torturers that also happened, torture people, be tortured, and then become a torturer. Okay. So that people actually went through the process themselves. All right. Other things they got, obviously we had a racist society, we still have very often, and racism was entrenched during the training, and they were taught essentially to enact it. I have not sanitized the language in the book. The words I've used are often quite offensive, the words that the people that I interviewed used, but I felt it was important to use it because it actually gives you an indication of what they were experiencing. So they would, for instance, in the training, they would have dolls they had to stab with bayonets until frak koffer. You get the message. Okay. Absolutely an inherent part of the training. Okay. Now, when I spoke to them, one of the very interesting things in the interviews with these people was that they spoke about their racism. I'm a psychologist. To get people to speak about their racist beliefs and attitudes is almost impossible. I've been in the job for more than 20 years, and the number of sessions I've had with people where they've openly spoken about racism, their own personal racism, 5, 6 probably in 20 years, except for these people. They speak openly about it. And they're unhappy about it. They decry it. They've got absolutely no idea how to change it. They would actually say, I did these things because I am racist. And when I would ask them, okay, but how do you not be racist? They would refer to language, that they mustn't use racist terms. But the idea that whiteness is central, that sort of thing, totally beyond them. The idea of white superiority, yes, of course. They've never ever entertained these thoughts. So I was talking a completely foreign language to them. Okay. The one thing they all also knew was they did not want their children to be racist. But they didn't know how to not teach their children to be racist. Okay. So quite interesting. I asked them how they felt about South Africa having changed. Now, I interviewed 3 people for the study. I've worked with many other perpetrators, but I only used 3 here. It was just far too much work. And I asked them how they felt about the changes in South Africa. It was fascinating. They all said it should have happened long ago. Which I didn't expect. I expected, because of their beliefs, because of what they've done, and they've all incurred a lot of personal loss. The one man was a hobo for a number of years because of what he experienced and what he did. He's okay at the moment, but he'd gone through pretty hard things. And when I said to him, so how do you feel? He just said, it should have happened a long time ago. This is far better than it was. A very interesting statement with him. On one occasion, he'd been unemployed for a long time. I said he'd been a hobo, he'd rehabilitated, got a job, kept losing his work because of the symptoms. Aggressive outbursts, badly behaved at work, blah, blah, blah. And he was unemployed for a while, and one day he came back in, and I said to him, and how are you doing? And he looked at me and he said to me with enormous excitement, I am a taxpayer. And I said, oh, are you glad you're paying taxes? And he said, yes, because then I can help rebuild the country I helped destroy. So very interesting. Anyone, any comments at this point? Or questions? Yes?
When were these 3 people policemen?
They were all either 80s or one beginning of the 90s.
Ending?
The last one, well, the one is still in the police. But I worked with him to the point of, he joined in 91. So we were talking there beyond 95, probably to about 98, 99. Yes.
As you said that when you asked them, you had with them in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken, they said it should have happened, a long time ago.
Yes.
Don't you think that the police system that trained them changed them to be evil in that way? Because the way I think of it is that they were not raised as racist, you understand? And then now being employed by the police and then being trained, now they tend to be these monsters, but they know in the end that being racist is wrong. So that's why they say.
Actually, I think it's, I should have mentioned something earlier. These were all Afrikaans white men that I interviewed. They came out of a racist environment. Okay. 2 of the 3 had been involved in similar incidents to the Waterkloof 4. The one of them, it's not impossible that as an adolescent you already killed someone. So they had all been involved in that. They would all say they weren't all this at home. But it was very clearly part of the environment that they'd grown up in. The police worsened it dramatically and gave them justification for it, I think, quite often. So the chance that they would have done something like this without being involved in the police, no, they wouldn't have. But within the police culture, yes, because of the entrenched racism, that was part of the training. Any other questions?
You mentioned the symptoms, but what are the kind of symptoms that these guys are presenting, 20 years down the line?
It's interesting, they were all referred for post-traumatic stress disorder. Do you know more or less the symptoms of PTSD or not? All right, let's run through that quickly. I'm going to just give a summary of them. They obviously keep changing because as more and more research comes in and the politics and the American Psychiatric Association and all the other things that happen, these things do change. But essentially, when we're looking at PTSD, we're looking at events that people have been exposed to. So it does not refer to doing things yourself. It refers to where you are a victim. Okay, but they've all been exposed to extreme violence as well. They've seen things they should never have been exposed to. So bystanders can also be affected by it, even in the latest definitions. But anyway, so what one will have a period of re-experiencing, which can happen in various ways, from nightmares to dissociative flashbacks. A dissociative flashback episode is when you actually have a break in reality and it feels like you are re-experiencing what has happened before. So let's take something like a rape. Someone was raped, it triggers, it's as though they are being raped again. That's a dissociative flashback episode. But you could have other physiological experiences and so on, psychological distress and so forth. Very often then people will also try and avoid situations that trigger it. They don't want to be around things that are going to make them remember it or bring up the symptoms again. So a lot of avoidance, often suppression, denial. It's not that bad. Often blunting of emotions. They don't feel anything. Things don't affect them anymore. That sort of thing. Struggle to experience certain emotions. And we often have a period of where we have extreme hyper-arousal. So they struggle to sleep, often have aggressive outbursts, struggle with concentration, that sort of thing. So they all come in with that, as well as depression, where we have a depressed mood, loss of interest or pleasure in things, sleeping patterns are disturbed, concentration's disturbed, feel bad about yourself, that sort of thing. So they came in with those dual diagnoses. But it seems that when people are exposed, when people perpetrate, that other symptoms start to arise. And there are lots of questions. I mean, should we be medicalizing this? Should we be saying this is a medical condition and people have done things that are actually evil? Or should we simply say they are badly behaved, they are evil human beings and leave them to it? But if we're going to medicalize it, and they medicalized it, they said they were addicted to torture. And they were all alcoholics as well. And there is some evidence that when people are exposed to this sort of thing, that they do, in a sense, become addicted. The one man, it was quite bad, the one that I read from earlier, he would say eventually it looks like an impulse control disorder. I'm going to use the psychiatric jargon. But essentially what he was saying eventually was the only way I can control my depression, my anxiety, my sense of, almost, what shall I call it? Almost a lack of feeling, is when I actually see or touch blood. Okay. This became very severe. And it's fascinating if you think in our language, we have terms such as bloodthirsty. It makes me begin to wonder if there isn't something underlying this that we have not researched, but possibly that there's meaning behind this. So what he would, for instance, on one occasion, when he obviously hadn't had enough people to torture or harm, he actually killed ducks. He sent the rookies in to go and get them out of the dam, and he killed them. Why? Because he had to touch blood. Okay. It was the only way he could control what he was feeling at that point. So, as he put it, eventually, he says, initially I tortured for God and country. Later, I tortured because I needed to, for myself. Other things that we find with him, and it seems to be a problem right through, is that the aggression is worse than with post-traumatic. With post-traumatic stress disorder, we do have aggressive outbursts. But it seems that with people where perpetration's been involved, that's a lot worse. In this case, of the 3 people that are used in this study, 2 tried to kill their families and had numerous suicide attempts as well. So the aggression's worse. Alcohol abuse seems to be worse when we deal with perpetration groups. And it's part of the culture. someone sees something bad and what happens, we'll take them to the canteen tonight and we'll expose them to more alcohol. Okay. So it gets linked very, very quickly. And I think it's a huge problem anyway in South Africa, the amount of alcohol that is used. So that is part of it. Other things in terms of what happens. It also seems to be a huge problem with perpetrator groups, and it sort of makes sense, is that their ability to connect to other people seems to be very damaged. And it makes sense, if you've done this sort of thing to someone else, how do you relate to people after that? How do you actually speak to other people? So the shame that comes in with it, enormous amounts of shame, and shame is not guilt. When I feel guilty, I want to fix things. When I feel shame, I want to hide. I don't want to be seen. So they felt completely isolated from their own communities. I did it for my community, but I cannot tell anyone what I have done. One of them said to me on one occasion, if I walk down the street and anyone could see what I have done, they'd all run away. And they would not be able to appear on a street with me. Does that give some idea of what we're dealing with here? Any other questions there?
How systematic was this, the violence in the restaurant? How systematic was the violence in the restaurant, or rather the violence and the torture? Was it almost systematic? Can we say that potentially every single police officer in their parts of tortured?
No.
So
No.
do we have an idea of how bad?
I have no idea, and you're not going to get it. Because remember, it's criminal behavior. This was probably the first reported study where people actually who do it spoke openly about what they do. It's incredibly difficult to get people who torture to tell you their stories. Zimbardo and Haggard and someone else, who was the other person, don't remember now. Harriet Futurosa, were working with the Brazilian torturers, and they actually could not get them. They would tell what happened in torture. And the book is called Violence Workers or something. They would tell about what happened in torture, but it was always a friend who did it. They would never say, I did it. Okay. In this instance, they all said, I did it. And one of the very interesting things was, I asked them, okay, about following orders. And they said, no, I was not given orders. I chose to. There was never this thing of, I was told to do it, or I was just following orders, the sort of cop-out, which we found also with Ahmad and so on. I just did what I was told. These people, for some reason, never said that. On one occasion, I said to the one man, again the one that I read from earlier, I said to him, yeah, but I mean, we're all guilty in some way if we didn't actively try and stop this stuff and we allowed apartheid to continue and so forth. So we all carry some guilt. And he looked at me and he said, yes, but you did not do what I did. Okay. And that for me was fascinating, this acceptance of responsibility, which again I think is quite unusual.
I wonder if you can give us a sense. I know there's a lot of extracts in the books that are quite disturbing,
Yes.
actually describing books. I wonder if there's an extract of a sense that you can choose and just see the sense of what they are guilty of and perpetrating instead of well.
Yes, I can look and see if I can find one. You wanted to ask, please.
If you are saying the police were not compelled to torture people, why it became a culture in the police system, and even now currently in our class?
It's a brilliant question. Yes.
So why it becomes
It's a brilliant question. I think it was expected during apartheid in a way. That is the one thing that we sort of, it was accepted, part of the training. The other thing is, has anyone ever, I mean it's a terribly old experiment, but if you've never looked it up, it's well worth the looking up. Has anyone ever looked at the Stanford prison experiment? Now, let me tell you it. I mean, it's one of those that it either makes your career or it destroys you. In Zimbardo's case, I think it more or less made him. He wrote a book relatively recently again, which goes quite a bit on the Stanford Prison Experiment. It's all online, so you can actually go and look at the videos. It's fascinating. So what he does, he says to people, okay, we're going to have an experiment. Everyone knows he's doing this. It's not a secret. They ask for volunteers, they get paid something or other every day for their involvement. It's going to last for 2 weeks. It's students. They refer them and they say, anyone who's got issues here, let's get rid of them. Do MMPIs and whatever screening devices. So we've got the most stable, emotionally sound crowd to work with. Fine. And it was something like, I think about 14, about that. I can't remember the exact numbers of students. Half of them are going to be prisoners, half of them are going to be guards. Okay. All of this is open. There's no hiding of any of it. So he gets the sheriff to cooperate, and Sunday morning they go out and they arrest the prisoners, who are students. And they are trotted off to the jail, which is now being created in the basement of Stanford Psychology Department. And the guards are put in, right, and we're going to video this whole thing and see how this develops. What are the interactions? It was done, I think, in conjunction with the Navy and some of the armed forces in America, because they were sort of saying, okay, but is it people? Why do these things get out of control? Let's try to understand what is happening. Are we choosing the wrong people as guards? So they do this. Right. They stopped it after, I can't remember the exact number, I think it's about 4 days, 5 days, they had to stop it. Because the guards were sadistic. They were harming the prisoners. One of the prisoners had apparently some sort of a breakdown and had to be rescued. Zimbardo, who was head of this, Professor Zimbardo, one of his research assistants had to come to him and say to him, Professor, you are more concerned about your prison than your students' welfare. Can you see what is happening? And he had to admit eventually this is what had happened. He was so involved in this, and it didn't take long for everyone not only to be role-playing, but to actually be living into this and harming each other. Which is terribly, terribly frightening, the thought that we can do this. And it's something that has to be kept in mind. So now we think of the police, we think in a situation where very often there's insufficient supervision and there are messages that are given. I've spoken to too many policemen who've said to me things like, yeah, well, the officer got to the scene, we'd arrested this person, blah, 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 and what did he say? He said, why is he alive? The message is clear. Okay. So the problem is, to actually get supervision in these sorts of situations is extremely difficult. So the message is people can do these things. And possibly one of the mistakes we make is thinking people won't do these things. Okay. Any other questions on this so far? What did you ask? You said
I was
something?
wondering if it might be an extra, just give us just to touch on what you're talking about in terms of perpetration.
In terms of perpetration, all right. All right, let's get one or two. Yep, there's one. Oh, that's right. I'm looking for the one in particular because it was such a nice one. Yeah.
Nice one.
Listen, I've worked with this stuff for 10 years. I accept at this stage my emotional response to it is no longer appropriate. I'm totally, it simply doesn't shock me any longer. But I'm going to give you this one. Yeah. Let's start with Tien's again, because Tien's really misbehaved quite badly. I'll read another section from Tien's maybe. We've got to balance what happened with this man, Sham. I'm vilifying him. Right, he talks about his minibus. This gives you an idea of the authorities and how they supported this. I don't know if it's still happening, but it certainly did happen. I found other accounts of the same thing. Tien's, my minibus was equipped. I took it to S, to K's upholstery. All the fabric sections were removed and replaced with rubber. Then you could squirt it with a garden hose and it would be clean. The seats were, and he's laughing, not behind one another, they were placed along the sides. The suspect sat in the middle on the chair of justice. This is the way my bus was equipped. Did no one ever say anything about this? No, because I did my work. I had the most arrests every month. I did the best work. You would park our minibus on the incline, take a garden hose, and squirt it on the outside, and then squirt it on the inside. It had rubber mats. You let it stand to dry and then you could drive again. Really, that minibus was well equipped. Now the mere fact that he could do this, okay, says an enormous amount about what the culture was at the time. Okay? I don't know, I doubt that this is still happening, but it gives an idea of what did happen. And he was rewarded with promotions. He had more arrests than anyone else, that sort of thing. Okay. He had, I think he said to me, every week he had an arrest for something like 2 years. So obviously then your seniors must be taking note of this. And yes, it reflects well on your police station. We've got very efficient staff here. And that's one of the questions we have to look at. What pressure do communities place on the police that they must provide results? And the impact it has on these people. So it's an incredibly complex issue. Let me just read what he got up to on this. In the locations, they knew about the minibus. They knew they had to be careful when the minibus was in the locations. Don't mess up. In T, I was the mayor there. They did nothing when my yellow minibus was there. Yellow, okay, they're white now. They knew we got away with everything. When there were cases against us, they said the Attorney General knows Tears. He knows, he is the car guard. I was always the car guard. They knew I did the assaults and all the good things, but I was the driver. The car was booked out in my name. How could I drive and assault someone? I couldn't sit behind the steering wheel and assault the man. How could I shock him with a coil while driving? But the coil was with me. When I touched the gear shift, I earthed the coil and I'd shock him. There was no place to earth it at the back. The wiring was in front with me. Things like that. We had plans, we had methods. Right, so I've mentioned now, and I think that is one of the critical things we actually have to think about, is how much do we actually demand this of the police? If you think about it, just in your normal day-to-day life, you hear of someone who has been raped, okay? And you hear that there were police on the scene. And you hear possibly, let's say you tell your friend the story, and they say, oh, well, I hope they killed him. I hope they killed him. He's an arsehole. We don't want scum like that. Okay. And these are very common things that happen in society. In other words, don't go through the normal process, let's just get rid of these people. And if we allow the rule of law to go, we sit with this sort of problem. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
The unmaking piece of this whole experience, is it possible really to unmake this? Because it explained that these people were trained to torture, and while they were trained, they were being tortured themselves to be able to torture. So for the person who's being tortured while this person was being trained, let's say you are trained to be able to torture someone, and during that whole training you tortured me as a normal woman, and I'm just an ordinary person. Is it possible for me to
okay. Let's talk about victims and perpetrators.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of victims, there's no way you're going to ever probably be the person you were before torture. Okay. But the broader question is, can we improve the experience of trauma? I would say yes, as a psychologist, and I hope I'm right. We have a number of techniques at the moment that seem to be giving very good results when we are dealing with various forms of trauma. I don't need to go into the technicalities of them, but we're as far that we can say there are a few methods that we can look at, and we can say these are evidence-based. They've been through numerous controlled trials and things now, enough to say, okay, these are international methods that are recommended for dealing with trauma, often very severe trauma. I attended actually a very, very interesting workshop, which I would love to follow up on. It was one of the Scandinavian countries, I can't remember which one, it was a year or two ago. victims of torture, which they were simply, it was acute, so in other words, it was very recent, it wasn't long term. Chronic makes a huge difference in terms of treatment methods. But these were acute, so recent, so we didn't have the changes, the biochemical changes that get perpetuated as it becomes a chronic condition. And with them, they used 8 sessions of a particular form of narrative therapy, and the results they were getting were actually quite good. I would love to see the follow-up studies. I've got their stuff somewhere, so at some point I'll follow up and see what they've got. But that was actually quite encouraging. Most of the time, narrative is when people actually tell stories. One of your problems with trauma is that narratives, the stories we tell, become fragmented. They don't actually make the story anymore. So if you speak to someone, if you look at the book I did as well, and you read it, often it's quite incoherent. And that's part of trauma. People cannot yet put the story together, the memory together. So they will tell bits. It's all over the place. And part of what one initially very often ends up doing is getting a story that can be told from beginning to end. It's part of putting it in a perspective. A way of saying, this is what happened, and this is the way I make sense of that which has happened. So that one was quite an interesting one. There are lots of other methods for more chronic things that seem to be giving quite good results. With this crowd, that was part of my predicament. There's no work on how do you treat perpetration. What do you do with people who have perpetrated? So I found it quite frightening. I use evidence-based stuff most of the time. I hate doing something where I have to fly by the seat of my pants. I'm not good at it. I'm working with people's lives, and I much prefer to know where I'm going to go and what results I'm going to get. I mean, if someone comes in who's been raped and she's not HIV positive, and she was not sexually abused as a child, I can know the first session, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing the second, this is what I'm doing third, and that is what I'm doing fourth, and I'll be finishing off. I know it all. I know exactly what each session will look like. I've done it for 20 years, I should. But when it comes to perpetrators, I have absolutely no idea. No idea where you start, what do you do, how do you do this. So that's part of the difficulty here. There is absolutely no research on it. Yes.
So, do you think it's possible for the perpetrator who are doing the totally volunteer? Or is it possible for the perpetrator who are doing his duty voluntarily since he was racist to raise his child?
I hope so.
To become non-sure.
Yep. I don't know. I think they're going to need an enormous amount of support in it. I'll read you one or two pieces there, which were interesting. I don't know how much of it is wishful thinking, but that they have. Let me read one or two sections as to the sessions progressed, because you might find that interesting. The first man I'm going to read a little bit of. He was actually quite an interesting character. He only joined the police in 1991. Involved in numerous assaults, and he lied to me, and I discussed the lying in the book, and why he lied, and what he lied about was a murder. I'll mention that quickly because it's quite an interesting story. He'd been acting out, behaving atrociously. We'd had numerous emergency hospitalizations. He tried to kill the family. He really was behaving badly. And at one of the emergency hospitalizations, I got there in the morning, and he said to me he's self-discharging. I didn't want him to because I felt I don't care at that point. He can kill himself, it's fine. It'll be a relief for everyone. But I was afraid he's going to kill someone else in the process. So I spoke to him. He got angry with me and he left. He went and sat in the parking area. And I thought, oh gosh, honestly, okay, let me go find him. Not in the room. Let's find him. Eventually, sitting there on the curbstone between the cars, I said to him, because I'm guessing, okay. And eventually I mentioned that possibly he'd killed someone, and he indicated he was listening, and it was yes, and blah, blah, blah. We went inside. He told me a long, convoluted story while vomiting, throwing up. It was messy. About what he'd got up to and how he'd killed someone. And I didn't believe a word of it. I knew he was lying. I knew he'd been involved in murder. But this was rubbish. I knew it was murder because of his physiological reactions. But I had no doubt it was total bullshit from beginning to end. Okay. Now that makes it terribly difficult if you're a shrink and you're working with someone, because one of the things you actually want is a little bit of honesty. But anyway, so later, about 6 months later, I called him out on it. We were talking, and then I said to him, "Yeah, and in the morning you lied to me." And he said, "Yeah, let me tell you the story. You knew I was lying." I said, "Yes, I knew you were lying." Okay, and the actual story was that they had, he'd been a senior policeman. They had got intelligence about some or other suspects they were worried about. They went to pick them up. They'd been drinking, policemen. And in the process of torturing the one, they shot him dead by accident. So they killed the other one because they didn't want to witness. And unfortunately, we get these stories repeatedly. If you read the news properly, you see them.
I keep losing my questions, but I'm just trying to answer. Did any after, say, like what the dentist question was, can you rehabilitate them?
I'm going to give you some of it. All right. Let me give you a little bit there. After I'd seen him for a while, this is one of the quotes. He said, "You know, I was always idealistic about the police. I made peace with being a policeman, right? And then I thought, I know I'm going to be a policeman. So let me make the best of it. Let me change things, make it better. But that's how it was taught in the school. If you kill him, you're protecting your country. I think that got stuck somewhere. You don't stand with an R1 with a fucking bayonet and stab these fucking things all the time saying, I'm killing you, die, I'm killing you, terrorist. I'm going to kill you, terrorist, without it getting stuck somewhere." So we can see some of the introspection developing. Let's find another one. Yeah. Another one. Yes. So after he had now confessed to the murder and what had happened there, I think what troubles me the most is that I did nothing about it. That is what troubles me. It kills me. I'm trying to justify it in a sense that I have overcompensated. I overcompensated at work a lot. I try to do things better, nicer, to try and make up for my fuck up. Do you understand? And it's very hard to admit. Like you said to me the other day, to accept that at a stage I was a coward. There are two things that trouble me most. That I was a coward in the sense that I did not report it, and I did nothing about it. I was too afraid to do anything because of the consequences for me. Do you understand? Not what the law would have done to me, but what those 3 policemen would have done to me. I always thought I was someone who was fairly, how can I put it, brave. I'm not afraid to die, or so I thought. When I realized these guys, that was inaudible, and I was afraid, I was petrified, and it frightened me the most. That's what stays with me. And it's interesting because you can see the introspection in this man as it starts to develop, and he starts to face himself and what he has done. An interesting, let me give you 2 in terms of the racism with him. And as I say, he says these things. I don't know. We will see. I do think he does try. I literally think myself into his shoes. He lives in a rural area. It's a fairly poor area that he lives in. Do I want to live in a shack? Do I want to walk a fucking 2 or 3 kilometers to pump water? Do I want my children to sit in a house with no food or clothes? Do I want to sit and worry when I'm going to get money and food? Do I want to work for 1,000 rand a month, and that's very hard work? Fuck woman, think of what they go through. I see it daily with my own eyes. Okay, as I say, it's a rural area, and it is quite a poverty-stricken area. And then eventually he says this, yes, I don't fully agree with their affirmative action, but fuck it, I would also have had affirmative action. I understand it. And he stayed in the police, this man. He knows he will receive no further promotions, but he has chosen to stay in the police. I understand it, okay. Even though it has a negative effect on me, it has a negative impact on me, but I understand it. I only hope that by the time my children are adults, that it will no longer be there, that everyone will be given an equal chance of training, brain power or not, or whatever, the best man for the job, and I will continue like this. I will continue this way if it will improve my children's chances in South Africa. So an interesting perspective, and quite a dramatic change for him. They're all working, these men, and they're all coping. The one this one, I want to read something of his. This is the man with the minibus who misbehaved in the townships. At some point, this is quite a long way, I saw him for 2 years on a weekly basis. He said the following, he said lots, but I've just opened there. I feel bad about what I did, because how many of those people did I harm? How did they put their lives together once I finished with them? What do they do? What do they do after everything I've done to them? We don't know at this stage. Yes, I'll never know. I won't get to 3/4 of the stuff. Okay. And he incidentally had intense remorse once we'd got past the macho, I'm the macho policeman who does all these things. He was, I saw him about 2 years, and from about the 6-month mark, it was actually terribly funny. We work in a house, and as he opened the security gate, he'd start crying. And he'd walk to my office and he would cry. And he would cry the entire time he sat there. And when he finished, he would get up, walk to the gate and cry. One day he came with a box of tissues, and I said, and he said, I'm just so afraid one day I'm going to get here and you're not going to have tissues. And it was intense remorse around what he had done. He also chose to leave the police. He was not compensated for an injury on duty. And part of it was that he said to me, I'm showing all this remorse, but I can never trust myself in a position of power over other people again, and removed himself from the situation.
At the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there were also some black policemen, who talked about how they become part of the torture routine. I think Jonas and one of those comes to mind, part of the fluffy
Yes.
ice group. Would you comment on that? Because at the moment it sounds as if it's just white torture.
No, it's not. No. It's far more complex than that. It's people. This last man, he worked eventually, he was the only white working in a team of black policemen. And the reason he gave for that is that way he could get away with more. He explained it quite explicitly. He said to me that it's better to work with black policemen. When they're working in the area where they know the community, they won't get involved in torture. But all you have to do is take them out of their own community and then they'll join in. Okay. No, I don't think racism was definitely part of it for these men, but I don't think it's always part of it.
Yes, just 2 questions. The first one, is there a part in the book where maybe talk about some kind of intimate relationship that was involved in?
Some kind of?
Of relationship, like was he married or
Yeah.
something?
They've all
First
been.
question.
Yes, let me mention what happened there. The first guy that I discussed in the book, he tried to kill his family. I was actually in the Helen with him one evening. He phoned at 2 o'clock in the morning to inform me he's now going to kill his family. He'd been drinking. Remember, alcohol is a problem with these people. They all stopped drinking while they were seeing me. I never focused on it, but they stopped it. And I eventually persuaded him to let his wife go and the kids go. Very irritated with him. And then to speak to his wife, and I insisted that she get him arrested. And he was arrested. He knew it was at my that I insisted on it. The fact that he still has a very good relationship says something with me. It's quite interesting. So he was arrested and the police would not drop charges. Small community, so he was highly embarrassed. After that he stopped. He knew that if he drinks again and acts out like that, I will have him arrested. I'm not tolerating this. It was simply not fair on him, on the children or his wife. They're still married, he works in the police, and as he says, his one child is punishing him for all his bad behavior. She's making life quite hard for him at the moment. But he knows he's worked hard for this. The one in the middle, which I haven't spoken much of, that's the one who was a hobo for a while. While he was working, he was part of one of the reaction units in KZN, and his wife divorced him at that point, and he remarried. An interesting story, the woman he remarried, they knew each other for 2 weeks. and he rescued her from a previously abusive husband she'd left and tried to kill him. He was eventually murdered, the man. He was a drug dealer, I think. Anyway, and he has been extremely violent. He has also threatened with a family murder on occasion. So this is what happens. It goes home with them. But they all decided they would do this because of their families. The last one, his wife committed suicide. And that was a disaster in his life. After the suicide, he had to look after the children, which had a lot of repercussions because then he could no longer work in the townships where he'd been working. And he's the one that had the bloodlust and could only relax if he was exposed to blood and blah, blah, blah. So after doing that, he had to resign because he couldn't work shifts any longer. But then what he started doing was taking illegal immigrants back to Mozambique because he could assault them on the trains. Okay. So that is the way he, in a way, satisfied his needs at that point, was to volunteer for those duties. Okay. And it was purely so that he could assault them. There was no other reason for it. I think if there's anything else there. Yeah, I think that's about it. As I said, they were all motivated because they have children to actually get involved in this process. And it's if you're a perpetrator and you have to face what you've done, it's an extremely difficult road to travel. Okay. They went through utter hell. And to me it was absolutely amazing. So I have a lot of respect for these people. That they actually had the courage to say, this is what I am, this is what I've done, and I'm prepared to face it. Yes.
My question is like, so base classification, what other interests those police like protect? Was like it seems that there were certain interests which they were protecting. As now you highlighted that the one is afraid of affirmative action, which is also promoting the black.
Yes.
So like what other interests which they were protecting?
The one man says at some point, we were there to protect white interests, okay, which I think is accurate. I don't think he was wrong in it. But I think they were all capable of being good policemen. The one who stayed on, I actually think he is a competent and very popular policeman in the community in which he is. And they were all involved in the normal things. They were involved in the township violence, a lot of them. The one with the combi was in Unit 19, one of the right units. And the one in the middle was also in one of the right units. He was also, I think, in 19, if I remember correctly, at some point. But they've all been exposed to the normal run of rapes and murders and all the normal violent crime in South Africa.
Elaine, we need to sort of finish up reasonably soon. Is there one or two questions, and I've got one last one too? So
It's fine. Yes.
Mine is around prevention, because once you are able to identify a cause of something, you know the symptoms, how to the symptoms as you explain. Definitely there should be a prevention to that thing, you know. And we're looking around, besides your experience and your people that you interviewed for the book, we're looking around the community, how things that are, you know, are happening, like the violence, the domestic violence, or rape, you know, all those sort of things. And now I try to think how we, or the society, try to discipline or make those people pay for what they did, is to go to prison. And for me, I think prison just made them worse because of the experience they get when they get there, the torture, all those things they get out. How do we then prevent? Because once they come out, they do the very same thing that was happening, you know, that they did before, or what was happening inside the prison. So how do we prevent?
I think it's an impossible question to answer in one or two lines. But I think if people have at least one good relationship, it can carry you through on many things. One good caring relationship which doesn't tolerate bad behavior. I don't think it's going to solve all the problems, but I think it does help.
It's a psychologist's response.
Of course. He thinks it was actually a good idea to have done it. And he gives an interesting story there, which is one of those that I quite enjoyed, about running into someone he'd known who'd been involved in some or other shooting, some activist. I don't know who it was. He couldn't remember the details of when he was telling me. Memory's often a problem with these sort of illnesses. But he ran into the man again. He'd known him well, and he was working in a butcher's shop. And he said to me, "This guy went to private schools, blah blah blah. He's working in a butcher's shop." And when he met him, he said to him, "Harold, hello." And he said, "How are you doing it, honey? You can see I am still a butcher."
Just got one final quick question,
Yes.
Elaine. You know, there was this video circulating recently, I'm not sure if you saw me in the CA or online, of, I think it was here in Cape Town, of a policeman.
Unfortunately, they were arrested, I think.
They were arrested.
Or suspended or
recently,
something, yeah.
Undressing a man and then, kicking him in the genitals, doing it all in public. And
Yes.
it seems to me, your book focuses on a particular group in a particular period, but I think there is a link in terms of torture to brutality, and a link. It's the same police service. And I wonder if you can maybe just give us an indication as to what's the way forward, really, from what you've learned from these three, knowing where we are at with police now.
Academically, it would be useful if we could somehow link the literature on torture and the literature on police brutality. For some reason, they're completely separate. If you read the work on torture, police brutality is never mentioned. If you read the work on police brutality, torture is never mentioned. So that's just interesting that that's happened historically, and I don't know why it's happened. But I think there's quite a lot of cross-pollination that should take place there that would actually help a bit to understand these events. In terms of the way forward with this, obviously I think part of it is assuming that people are going to do this. It's not assuming they're not going to do it. And the problem is very often inadequate supervision, I think. I'm not a policeman. I'm a psychologist, so I work with the shrink stuff. But I know that with a lot of the people I see, it's either that there is insufficient supervision or that things are said unofficially. And that they can get away with it.